Welcome, friends, to Midnight Lullabies. Tonight's story is from Weird Tales, Volume 1, Issue 1, March 1923. The Dead Man's Tale by Willard E. Hawkins. 7. With utmost caution, I entered the bedroom. My control of Lewis's body was complete. I felt for perhaps the first time so corporeally secure that the vague dread of being driven out did not oppress me. The room was dark, but the soft, regular breathing of Velma, asleep, reached my ears. It was like the invitation that rises in the scent of old wine which the lips are about to quaff, quickening my eagerness and setting my brain on fire. I did not think of love. I lusted, but my lust was to destroy that beautiful body. To kill. However, I was cunning. With caution, I felt my way toward the desk and secured the revolver, filling its chambers with leaden emissaries of death. When all was in readiness, I switched on the light. She wakened almost instantly. As the radiance flooded the room, a startled cry rose to her lips. It froze, unuttered, as, half rising, she met my gaze. Her beauty, the raven blackness of her hair falling over her bare shoulders and full heaving bosom, fanned the flame of my gory passion into fury. In an ecstasy of triumph, I stood drinking in the picture, while I temporized with the lust to kill, prolonging the exquisite sensation. She was battling for self-control. "Lewis!" The name was gasped through bloodless lips. Involuntarily I shrank, reeling a little under her gaze. A dormant something seemed to rise in feeble protest at what I sought to do. The leveled revolver wavered in my hand. But the note of panic in her voice revived my purpose. I laughed, mockingly. "Lewis!" Her tone was sharp, but edged with terror. "Lewis, put down that pistol! You don't know what you're doing!" She struggled to her feet and now stood before me. God, how beautiful, how tempting that bare white bosom. "Put down that pistol!" she ordered hysterically. She was frantic with fear, and her fear was like the blast of a forge upon the white heat of my passion. I mocked her. A shrill, maniacal laugh burst from my throat. She had said I didn't know what I was doing? Oh yes, I did. "I'm going to kill you! Kill you!" I shrieked and laughed again. She swayed forward like a wraith as I fired. Or perhaps that was the trick played by my eyes as darkness overwhelmed me. 8. A few fragmentary pictures stand out in my recollection like clear-etched cameos on the scroll of the past. One is of Lewis, standing dazedly, slightly swaying as with vertigo, looking down at the smoking revolver in his hand. On the floor before him, a crumpled figure in ebony and white and vivid crimson. Then, a confusion of frightened men and women in oddly assorted nondescript attire, uniformed officers bursting into the room and taking the revolver from Lewis's unresisting hand, clumsy efforts at lifting the white-robed body to the bed, a crimson stain spreading over the sheet. A doctor, attired in collarless shirt and wearing slippers, bending over her. Finally, after a lapse of hours, a hushed atmosphere, efficient nurses, the beginning of delirium. And one other picture, of Lewis, cringing behind the bars of his cell, denied the privilege of visiting his wife's bedside, crushed, dreading the hourly announcement of her death, filled with unspeakable horror of himself. Velma still lived. The bullet had pierced her left lung and life hung by a tenuous thread. Hovering near, I watched with dispassionate interest the battle for life. For the time, I seemed emotionally spent. I had made a supreme effort. Events would now take their inevitable course and show whether I had accomplished my purpose. I felt neither anxious nor overjoyed, neither regretful nor triumphant, merely impersonally curious. A fever set in, lessening Velma's slender chances of recovery. In her delirium, her thoughts seemed always of Lewis. Sometimes she breathed his name pleadingly, tenderly, then cried out in terror at some fleeting rehearsal of the scene in which he stood before her, the glitter of insanity in his eyes, the leveled revolver in his hand. Again, she pleaded with him to give up his work at the bank, and at other times she seemed to think of him as over on the battlefields of Europe. Only once did she apparently think of me, when she whispered the name by which I had called her, Winky, and added, Dick. But save for this exception, it was always, Lewis, Lewis. Her constant reiteration of his name finally dispelled the apathy of my spirit. Lewis. All the vengeful fury towards him I had experienced when my soul went hurtling into the region of the disembodied returned with thwarted intensity. When Velma's fever subsided, when the long fight for recovery began, and she fluttered from the borderland back into the realm of the physical, when I knew I had failed, balked of my prey, I had at least this satisfaction. Never again would these two, the man I hated and the woman for whom I hungered, never again would they be to each other as they had been in the past. The perfection of their love had been irretrievably marred. Never would she meet his gaze without an inward shrinking. Always on his part, on both their parts, there would be an undercurrent of fear that the incident might recur, a grisly menace, poisoning each moment of their lives together. I had not schemed and contrived, and dared, in vain. This was the thought I hugged when Lewis was released from jail upon her refusal to prosecute. It caused me sardonic amusement when, in their first embrace, the tears of despair rained down their cheeks. It recurred when they began their pitiful attempts to build anew on the shattered foundation of love. And then, creepingly, slyly, like a bird of ill omen casting the shadow of its silent wings over the landscape, came retribution. Many times, in retrospect, I lived over that brief hour of my return to physical expression, my hour of realization. Wraith-like arose a vision of Velma as she had stood before me that night, staring at me with horror. I saw the horror deepen to abject despair. How beautiful she had looked. But when I tried to picture that beauty, I could recall only her eyes. It mattered not whether I wished to see them. They filled my vision. They seemed to haunt me. From being vaguely conscious of them, I became acutely so. Disconcertingly, they looked out at me from everywhere, eyes brimming with fear, eyes fixed and staring, filled with horrified accusation. The beauty I had once coveted became a thing forbidden, even in memory. If I sought to peer through the veil as formerly, to witness her pathetic attempts to resume the old life with Lewis, again, those eyes. It may perhaps sound strange for a disembodied creature, one whom you would call a ghost, to wail of being haunted. Yet haunting is of the spirit, and we of the spirit world are immeasurably more subject to its conditions than those whose consciousness is centered in the material sphere. God, those eyes! There is a refinement of physical torture, which consists of allowing water to fall drop by drop for an eternity of hours upon the forehead of the victim. Conceive of this torture increased 1,000-fold, and a faint idea may be gained of the torture that was mine. From seeing everywhere, constantly, interminably, two orbs ever filled with the same expression of horror and reproach. Much have I learned since entering the land of the shades. At that time I did not know, as I know now, that my punishment was no affliction from without, but the simple result of natural law. Cause set in motion must work out their full reaction. The pebble, cast into a quiet pool, makes ripples which in time return to the place of their origin. I had cast more than a pebble of disturbance into the harmony of human life, and through my intense preoccupation in a single aim, had delayed longer than usual the reaction. I had created for myself a hell. Inevitably, I was drawn into it. Gone was every desire I had known to hover near the two who had so long engrossed my attention. Haunted, harried, scourged by those dreadful accusers, I sought to fly from them to the ends of the earth. There was no escape. Yet, driven frantic, I still struggled to escape, because that is the blind impulse of suffering creatures. The emotions that had so swayed me when I tried to blast the lives of two who held me dear now seemed puny and insignificant in comparison with my suffering. No physical torment can be likened to that which engulfed me until my very being was but a seething mass of agony. Through it I hurled maledictions upon the world, upon myself, upon the Creator. Horrible blasphemies I uttered. And at last, I prayed. It was but a cry for mercy, the inarticulate appeal of a tortured soul for surcease of pain, but suddenly a great peace seemed to have come upon the universe. Bereft of suffering, I felt like one who had ceased to exist. Out of the silence came a wordless response. It beat upon my consciousness like the buffeting of the waves. Words known to human ears would not convey the meaning of the message that was borne upon me. Whether from outside source or welling up from within, I do not know. All I know is that it filled me with a strange hope. 1,000 years or a single instant, for time is a relative thing, the respite lasted. Then I sank, as it seemed, to the old level of consciousness, and the torment was renewed. Endure it now I knew that I must, and why. A strange new purpose filled my being. The light of understanding had dawned upon my soul, and so I came to resume my vigil in the home of Velma and Lewis. 9. A brave heart was Velma's, dauntless and true. With the effects of the tragedy still apparent in her pallor and weakness, and in the shaken demeanor and furtive, self-destructive attitude of Lewis, she yet succeeded in finding a place for him as overseer of a small country estate. I have said that I ceased to feel the torment of passion for Velma in the greater torment of her reproach. But I had never ceased to love her. As I now realized, I had desecrated that love, had transmuted it into a horrible travesty, had, in my abysmal ignorance, sought to obtain what I desired by destroying it. Yet, beneath it all, I had loved. Well, I know now that, had I succeeded in my intention toward her, Velma would have ascended to a sphere utterly beyond my comprehension. Merciful fate had diverted my aim, had made possible some faint restitution. I returned to Velma, loving her with a love that had come into its own, a love unselfish, untainted by thought of possession. But to help her, I must again hurt her cruelly. Out of the chaos of her life, she had slowly restored a semblance of harmony. Almost she succeeded in convincing Lewis that their old peaceful companionship had returned. But to one who could read her thoughts, the nightmare thing that hovered between them weighed cruelly upon her soul. She was never quite able to look into her husband's eyes without a lurking suspicion of what might lie in their depths. Never able to compose herself for sleep without a tremor lest she should wake and to find herself confronted by a fiend in his form. I had done my work only too well. Now, slowly and inexorably, I began again undermining Lewis's mental control. The old ground must be traversed anew because he had gained in strength from the respite I had allowed him, and his outdoor life gave him a mental vigor with which I had not been obliged to contend before. On the other hand, I was equipped with new knowledge of the power I intended to wield. I shall not relate again the successive stages by which I succeeded, first in influencing his will, then in partially subduing it, and finally in driving his personality into the background for indefinite periods. The terror that overwhelmed him when he realized that he was becoming a prey to his former aberrations may be imagined. To shield Velma, I performed my experiments when possible when he was away from her, but she could not long be unaware of the moodiness, the haggard droop of his shoulders which accompanied his realization that the old malady had returned. The deepening terror in her expression was like a scourge upon my spirit. But I must wound her in order to cure. More than once I was forced to exert my power over Lewis to prevent him from taking violent measures against himself. As I gained the ascendancy, a determination to end it all grew upon him. He feared that unless he took himself out of Velma's life, the insanity would return and force him again to commit a frenzied assault upon the one he held most dear. Nor could he avoid seeing the apprehension in her manner that told him she knew, the shrinking that she bravely tried to conceal. Though my power over him was greater than before, it was intermittent. I could not always exercise it. I could not, for example, prevent his borrowing a revolver one day from a neighboring farmer, on pretense of using it against a marauding dog that had lately visited the poultry yard. Though I knew his true intention, the utmost that I could do, for his personality was strong at the time, was to influence him to postpone the deed he contemplated. That night, I took possession of his body while he slept. Velma lay, breathing quietly in the next room, for as this dreaded thing came upon him, they had, through tacit understanding, come to occupy separate bedrooms. Partially dressing, I stole downstairs and out to the tool shed where Lewis, fearing to trust it near him in the house, had hidden a revolver. As I returned, my whole being rebelled at the task before me, yet it was unavoidable if I would restore to Velma what I had wrenched from her. Quietly, though I entered her room, a gasp, or rather a quick hysterical intake of breath, warned me that she had wakened. I flashed on the light. She made no sound. Her face went white as marble. The expression in her eyes was that which had tortured me to the depths of a hell more frightful than any conceived by human imagination. A moment I stood swaying before her with leveled revolver, as I had stood on that other occasion months before. Slowly, I lowered the revolver and smiled. Not as Lewis would have smiled, but as a maniac formed in his likeness would have smiled. Her lips framed the word, Lewis. But in the grip of despair she made no sound. It was the despair, not merely of a woman who felt herself doomed to death, but of a woman who consigned her loved one to a fate worse than death. Still, I smiled, with growing difficulty, for Lewis's personality was restive and my time in the usurped body was short. In that moment, I was not anxious to give up his body. At this new glimpse of her beauty through physical sight, my love for Velma flamed into hitherto unrealized intensity. For an instant, my purpose in returning was forgotten. Forgotten was the knowledge of the ages which I had sipped since last I had occupied the body in which I faced her. Forgotten was everything, save Velma. As I took a step forward, my arms outstretched, my eyes expressing God knows what depth of yearning, she uttered a scream. Blackness surged over me. I stumbled. I was being forced out. Out! That cry of terror had vibrated through the soul of Lewis, and he was struggling to answer it. Instinctively, I battled against the darkness, clung to my hard-won ascendancy. A moment of conflict, and again I prevailed. Once more I smiled. The effect of it must have been weird, for I was growing weaker, and Lewis had returned to the attack with overwhelming persistence. My tongue strove for expression. Sorry, Winky. It won't happen again. I'm not coming back. When I recovered from the momentary unconsciousness that accompanies transition from the physical to spiritual, Lewis was looking in affright at the huddled figure of Velma, who had fainted away. The next instant he had gathered her in his arms. Though I had come near failing in the attempt to deliver my message, I had no fear that my visit would prove in vain. With clear prescience, I knew that my utterance of that old familiar nickname, Winky, would carry untold meaning to Velma, that hereafter she would fear no more what she might see in the depths of her husband's eyes, that with a return of her old confidence in him, the specter of apprehension would be banished forever from their lives.